Carla Seal-Wanner and Dr. Howard Gardner will take us through a fascinating conversation today. And there'll be plenty of time for Q&A, and they'll do a little bit of introduction themselves, because I'm sorry I don't have the right glasses on. Thank you, but they don't really need any introduction to those of you who know this field.
To be joined today by Howard, who I had the honor of studying with many years ago. We won't say how many, but in an institution that's kind of down the road a piece. You know, I'm wondering how many people here. Several people have come up already since Howard arrived, who were former students of his. So I wonder how many people have some connection to the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Raise your hands. Yay, HGSE. For me, it was really a great place to be, because I wanted to be a developmental and cognitive psychologist, but I always knew I wanted it to be applied work. And Howard was one of the people who I met early on in my career there. Influenced my professional development from the time I started making media for kids, which was my first job was at Children's Television Workshop, now called Sesame Workshop. Those of us who are older donors will always call it CTW. And as you see from this slide, these are many books that are on my bookshelf at my desk at home in New York City. And this is sort of my go-to place when I need inspiration. And as you can see, he's really in good company there with Bruner and Arnheim and Papert and a lot of other people who I hope folks in this room read consistently as well. I was recently looking at a PBS show called Open Minds, where you were interviewed by Richard Hefner. And Richard asked a question, a very good question, I can't remember what it was, but Howard's answer was, "That is such a good question that I've written 3 books on that topic." I'm hoping that there will be many of those kind of instances today. And I'm sure that, as many of you know, he's the most prolific writer and has had a huge impact on the way education has adapted developmental and cognitive theory and made it applied and made school settings much richer and more meaningful for kids. I wanted to start out a little bit by asking you about, you joked recently in a talk I heard you give about how people ask you, how did 9 intelligences turn into 5 minds? And so I wondered if you could take us through that trajectory a little bit, because I think people here are interested in the kinds of things that impact learners today in the real world. And so I think that's a very interesting journey that you went on, and they would learn a lot from you.
Sure. Well, thanks, Carla. Good to be here with you, and already connected to several people from earlier times. This is a question where I could talk for easily for a few hours, so I want you to cut me off after a few minutes. But as you said, I'm basically trained in cognitive developmental psychology. My teacher, which was your grand teacher, was Jerome Bruner, who, as Carla said, is somebody whom you know. Piaget was Bruner's teacher, so there's a lineage there. And for the first years, I did kind of standard empirical research with kids, but also with brain damage patients. That was somewhat less usual. And it was out of the work of those 2 populations that I developed the theory of multiple intelligences. And if anybody's here is lucky enough never to have heard of the theory, I'll save you a lot of work. Basically, instead of intelligence being a single thing which can be measured by an IQ test, the basic claim of that theory is that human beings are better thought of as having several relatively independent computational capacities. What we call intelligence, what we measure by the IQ test, is whether you're good in language and logic. I'm going to take off in a few minutes to tell to screw up a joke, okay? this kid goes shopping at Stop and Shop, and it's got a full basket of stuff, and he goes into the line where it says 12 objects or like 12 items or less, and the Cambridge teller looks at him and says, "Well, did you go to MIT and you can't read, or did you go to Harvard and you can't count?" You wouldn't be here if you weren't relatively good with language and logic, but what I try to do with MI theory is talk about other forms of intelligence, interpersonal, spatial, etc. So that's the theory. And one thing which I think probably isn't appreciated by many people is when you do something and you have one set of expectations and something very different happens, it has an impact on you. That seems banal, but I thought that the stuff I wrote about intelligence has been basically before psychologists and psychometricians. They've never been much interested in that. But educators, as you probably know, became very interested in MI theory, and that caused about a 10 or 15-year shift to a focus on education. And I didn't really have an educational philosophy when I started out doing psychology, but I think it was very much influenced at a kind of unconscious level, both by Dewey, you all know, and by Bruner. In fact, I worked in 1965, before your parents were born, I worked with Bruner. You're supposed to smile there. I worked with Bruner on something called Manor Course of Study. How many of you have heard of Manor Course of Study? Okay, well, actually quite a few. Shady Hill School here was the last one to use it. And so I had, kind of a progressive Dewey Bruner influence in my background, but it was only after educators got very interested in MI that I began to think about my own education philosophy. And I wrote a bunch of books in education, still as recently as 2 years ago. But once you go into education, you cannot think you're doing science, because education is fundamentally a values-based endeavor. And anybody who disagrees, I'm happy to debate it with you at length. And anybody who's recommending what we should do in education is essentially moving into policy. Because if you favor one approach rather than another, if you favor one kind of curriculum or one kind of assessment or one kind of medium rather than another, you're reflecting what you think ought to be done, and that's a value judgment. So, full stop, I wrote a very short book which was published in Spanish, and it's kind of American because I speak or write Spanish. It was called, I can't even remember the Spanish name, I think, Cinque Mentes della Futuro or something like that. Probably half Italian, half Spanish. And I thought the little book, which was barely 100 pages, had an argument which was worth putting into English. So in the middle of the 2000s, I wrote a book called 5 Minds for the Future. And as Carla said, some people said, "Oh, Howard, you thought that there are 7 or 8 or 9 intelligences, and now you're down to 5. What happened?" And the answer is, I stopped being a psychologist/scientist and began to be a policymaker. And these are the 5 minds which, if I had been the czar in 2005, these are what I would have legislated. But I do remember what happened to the czar, so I've been a little bit lower. So there's 5 minutes on your question.
That's great. For this audience, I wondered if you could dwell on it a little bit longer and talk about some of the things that relate to why this is so important, about globalization and technology and sort of the fast pace of the kind of information society that kids are growing up in today.
Okay.
We have we're used to kids, it seems like yesterday we were talking about kids clicking and pointing before they could speak, and now kids are using touchpads, which, as you mentioned Bruner earlier, is basically their sort of first way of interacting with the world and representing the world by gesturing. Now they have this immediate contact with information from this earliest age.
Well, let me give you a two-part answer. When I wrote the book 5 Minds for the Future, I wasn't particularly thinking about the digital world. And that's because even in 2004, 2005, it wasn't nearly as big an influence. I mean, Facebook hadn't been started yet.
There was the time for Facebook?
And, you know, Twitter, these things had not been developed. And I actually played with the notion of a technological mind and rejected it, and I probably still would reject it, just like I rejected the notion of a digital intelligence. Now you might say, why did I reject the notion of a digital intelligence? And very simply, that's because I think it's part of logical mathematical in thinking. It's part of bodily kinesthetic and moving around whatever your platform is. But in the years since, can we go back to the previous slide? Great. In the years since, I've thought a lot about how these 5 minds are impacted by living in a digital world. And trying, again, not to give an overly long answer, I think the disciplined mind is the most threatened. Because discipline basically means working steadily on stuff day in, day out and getting better. It's like, practice piano or play chess. Except for the geeks, the 10% that Mimi Ito writes about, who really live in developing a skill on and offline. It's very easy to have your attention wander and to go from one thing to another, and the notion of sitting in your tuchus and working and stuff every day, I think, is threatened. Also, and I'm not happy about this, but I am a realist, I think in earlier writings, which a few of you will know, I argue that you shouldn't do interdisciplinary work until you've mastered some disciplines. And conceptually, I think that's true, but it doesn't make sense anymore, because once you enter the cyber world, all the disciplines are vermished, to use another technical term. And you can't say, well, I'm not going to go in biology because I'm doing chemistry now. It doesn't make any sense. So I think the whole relationship between, I did have this idea about 10 years ago. I don't remember how much I wrote about it. We have to do more backfilling. What does that mean is, you kind of have to fake that you know a bunch of disciplines because so much stuff is interdisciplinary. But ultimately, if you don't go back and you learn the basics, you can't go much further. So your choice is either to go back and be a student, or to find somebody else or some other people who've got that disciplinary thing. So I think discipline and interdiscipline are really very, very shaky. Just a word on the others. Synthesizing mind, I talked about this. Murray Gell-Mann, the great physicist, said in front of me 15 years ago, he said, in the 21st century, the synthesizing mind is going to be the most important one. This is before the World Wide Web, even. And yet, we're all inundated with stuff. Unless we can organize it, we're going to be just overwhelmed. Now, because you guys are much more into the cyber world than I am, you'll be able to mention 25 programs would synthesize. But do they synthesize in the way that you want from your purpose? For your purpose, that's a more complicated question. On the creating mind, my one-liner here is that I think the digital world will radically increase the amount of middle C creativity, but I'm not sure it will radically increase big C creativity. We just don't know yet. So, people used to work alone or before in a small group. Now, as I walk by Broad and Coke on the way over here, you've got teams of thousands of people working together, and that's because many of the issues can't be done by a few people anymore. But it's not completely clear that if you put 5,000 people together, they're going to be big C any more than if you have Einstein sitting alone in the patent office thinking about things. I'm not going to talk about the respectful ethical mind now but people can ask me about it because that's what we've been working on for the past 6 years. And if you go to thegoodproject.org and you click on Good Play, you can read what Carrie James and Katie Davis and I have been doing on this stuff. Basically, the question we've been asking is, how are values transformed by the Wild West of the cyber world? But I said I was going to give you 2 answers. I've given you answer number 1. Answer number 2 is a plug, but it's a very authentic plug. with Katie Davis, a great student of mine who is now teaching at the University of Washington. We have a book coming out this fall called The App Generation. The subtitle is Identity, Intimacy, and Imagination in Today's Digital Youth. So this should be of interest to people here. I am a student of David Reisman, probably not known to people, but he was the most famous scholar in America 50 years ago. When my wife misbehaved in 7th grade in Ann Arbor, her punishment was to read The Lonely Crowd, which was David Reisman's famous book. In Reisman's book, he talked about the history of American character. I think that was the subtitle. And he said in the 18th century, Americans were tradition-directed. You know, they came from Europe, where there was a very big shadow of, religion and culture and so on. In the 19th century, Americans were inner-directed. They had a kind of internal compass. They went to the frontier. They decided what they wanted to do, and they sort of had chucked tradition. In the 20th century, this was Reisman writing in 1950. For extra credit, one of the authors of The Lonely Crowd is still alive and living in Cambridge. Does anybody know who it is? I should pull out your name and give you a reward. Nathan Glazer. Lonely Crowd is David Reisman, Nathan Glazer, and Rule Denny. And that Glazer is over 90. He's actually read The App Generation, because since he had created in the 20th century, it was other-directed. It was always looking around at what other people are doing. Keeping up with the Joneses, a suburban life. This is your grandparents. So Katie and I came up with the phrase, the app generation, because based on a lot of empirical work, which I won't take time to describe now, we concluded that people who are younger than you, in fact, younger than Katie, the opening of the book is a conversation between me, the complete digital immigrant, Katie, who's 33, which is borderline digital immigrant native, and Molly, 16, who's a total digital native, talking about how do you characterize kids today? And basically, kids think there is an app for everything. There should be an app for everything. If there isn't, either go out and invent it or don't do it anymore. We want things fast. We want them available on demand, and then we go on. So the thing which I think is very relevant to this group, and if we ever get any publicity for the book, it'll be because of this idea, is the difference between app dependence and app enablement, and the bonus, which only Einstein gets, app transcendent. Now, you're pretty smart, so you'll have figured out app dependent means you do what the app does, and only what the app does, and that's it. App enablement means the app opens something up, but it's quite open-ended. Where's Liz Margolis? Here up there. You can do, Liz works at the Museum of Modern Art, where they have Art Lab, which is a very clever art-making kind of thing. And I think it's an art-enabling thing. You can go in lots of different ways, but you've also got a lot of paint-by-number kinds of things available. Those are app-dependent. They can't really, they can't take you anywhere. And app-transcendent, which is where you get the big C, you just say, screw it, and I'm just going to work on my own. And I was thinking about this, Carla's going to take us in the 21st century, but we're doing the same thing that Socrates was doing. You could be Socrates, I could be Socrates. There is something about getting in one room physically, which we're probably not going to get rid of, even if MOOCs take over most of the world. So that's...
Well, that is a perfect segue for what I want to propose here, too. In preparing for this conversation, I went back to my bookshelf and I looked at a lot of the stuff that Bruner wrote, and I went back and looked at a lot of the man-course study stuff where he talks about media making being a big part of, and it wasn't called that in those days, but that's what it was. It was basically man-course study was a multimedia curriculum. I encourage everybody to go. There's a big site where they've archived all the stuff you've seen. It's really amazing to go back and look at the stuff, as Howard said, that he was thinking about in those days. But I've been thinking a lot about what's been proposed, bringing us into the 21st century, for Common Core standards for 21st century literacy. And I've been thinking that there really is a huge relationship between a lot of the early principles of progressive learning and what people are proposing learners have to be able to do to be prepared to be, as you would say, good citizens and good workers primarily, but to achieve the goals that they need to get out of high school successfully and then go on to do good work in society. And the connection to the 5 minds seems so powerful to me that I wondered if you could comment on that a little bit about how it goes back to really, if you think about particularly the some of the other common core issues are related to, you know, like in principles of progressive learning, there's learning by doing, more experiential learning, focusing on curriculum that has thematic units, emphasis on problem solving and critical thinking, group work and development of social skills, understanding and action of goals of learning as opposed to rote knowledge, collaborative and cooperative learning projects, education for social responsibility and democracy. I mean, you can layer these things all into various aspects of your construction of the 5 minds. And in the Common Core, it's interesting. It'll be interesting to see how teachers adapt these into the classroom, and perhaps this will be the place that your book has great purpose, because they're going to need a lot of help. You know, again, it's critical thinking and problem solving, creativity and innovation, collaborative team and leadership skills, cross-cultural understanding, and interpersonal communications. But the main one that they focus on is communication and media fluency. And I wonder if that's a way to think about how this sort of distinction that you make between apps. The one is the, you know, being dependent on it, and one is being generative with the apps and actually transforming that information, or as Bruno would say, going beyond the information given, perhaps.
So, I live in a school of education where I'm fighting one person battle to call it the Graduate School of Lifelong Learning, because that's really where it's at.
Yeah.
Of course, at my age, it better be, there. As you were talking, Carla, you asked these narrow questions. I was thinking,
I have a teacher.
Alfred North Whitehead, the great philosopher of 100 years ago, said all philosophy is a footnote to Plato. And I think it's amazing how often in this book, The App Generation, I quote Whitehead. It's almost frightening. I think all American educational thinking is a footnote to John Dewey. Yet Ellen Lagerman, who many people know here, who was our dean for a while, said what Americans forget is in the struggle between Dewey and Thorndike, Thorndike won. Thorndike is probably not known to most of you. He was a professor at Teachers College, actually. John Dewey was at Columbia, but not particularly at Teachers College, which is interesting in itself. But Thorndike was a test skill, kick-ass kind of person, and that's been the predominant view of education, actually all over the world, but particularly in the United States. And it's kind of interesting that it has been. You know, as you said, I'm guilty of a lot of books, so I keep coming back to stuff I've written. But an early book was called The Unschooled Mind. And the unschooled mind is intended to describe very common sense notions that people have that occur to them very readily, but are wrong. So like, you know, the common sense notion is you have a sugar cube and you keep cutting it into pieces, and when you can't see a piece anymore, there's nothing there. You know, that would get rid of atomic theory and subatomic particles, but common sense, if you can't see it, there's nothing there. The common sense view of education all over the world since before Socrates is there's a big person who knows a lot and has a lot of power, and then the little people who know nothing and have little power, nudniks as we call them. And the purpose is to get stuff as efficiently from the big persons with the big head into the little person with the little head. That's the default view of education everywhere. And progressive education has always been a kind of a minority, meaning a less than 10 or 15% education in this country. Your daughter went to Little Red Schoolhouse, my kids went to Shady Hill. You know, people who preached that stuff would get shot if they went south of the Mason-Dixon line or west of the...
My husband used to say they don't call it Little Red for nothing.
But
Rosenbergs did go there. The kids of Rosenberg.
for the Rosenbergs, for those of you who haven't looked it up yet, were the spies that were executed when I was 10 years old.
Sorry.
I think what you're driving at, this century is going to be the real test whether progressive education here and abroad can be more than a minority. I mean, a minority who means just a very small number of people. It's got nothing to do with skin color. One of the stories I tell in the app generation is a kind of a smart-ass kid, one of you. It came up to me after I gave a talk, and he said, "Why do we need school anymore when the answers to all questions are contained here?" And I looked at him and I said, "Yeah, the answer to all questions except the important ones." And he's kind of taken aback because he was a smart-ass and he wasn't used to having a smart-ass respond to him with that. But a lot of the stuff we do now in school, in the New York Times today, by the way, is a very interesting little article about how math was tested in 2010 and how it's going to be tested in the Common Core. That was quite interesting. There's no point anymore in asking about anything you can look up. And this is where there was a very important op-ed in the New York Times on Saturday, which was the most circulated over the weekend. In fact, Anthony Weiner has now taken over from John Maynard, N.E.H.T.A., a very good young faculty member at Harvard, about the failed effort in America to deprofessionalize teaching and why it's never going to work, and yet that's what we've been trying to do for many, many years, make it into a completely non-progressive kind of thing. And that's the fight that's going to be taking place. I'm being interviewed on Wednesday for a little thing that's at the Ed School about research and practice in education. And they gave me the questions. And the first question is, why is there so little use in education of the results of research? And I was going to give the usual answer. And then I had a wonderful memory. I remembered something. The most important book written in education in the last 10 years, and if you haven't heard about it, then you aren't wasting your time here, is Pasi Sahlberg's book, Finished Lessons. How many of you know about the book? Okay, not enough. Pasi Sahlberg is a Finnish educator. He's actually speaking at BC on the 22nd of April and at Harvard at the 23rd. And he describes how Finland went from being a know-nothing country in education in 1970 to the most admired education system in the world in 40 years. And if you're lazy, go to page 103, where he lists what he calls the germ theory of education, which is global education resource management, GERM, which is what everything in Washington and London is being done according to, tests and assessments and kick-ass, and what they're doing in Finland, which is exactly the opposite, and somehow they managed to become the most successful educational country in the world. But here's the interesting thing, and this blew my mind. He said in the 70s and 80s and 90s, we read the results of American educational research and used it. And that blew my mind. And this isn't my research particularly, but the research that people at Columbia and Stanford and Harvard and Berkeley is not a waste of time. But do any policymakers ever say, I'm going to do anything different? So let me tell you, we were joking earlier, we were offered some, was it brownies?
Cupcakes.
Cupcakes.
Which Claire promised
Claire,
to
right.
too.
And I said, well, we should get this after we talked before. This brought up Skinner, and then she said...
It was really a secret.
And then she said, well, you can have one now, or if you wait, you can have In the first chapter of the App Generation, and this is one of my few contributions to the book, I talk about a study, which probably nobody here has heard of. I heard about it by accident. And I said, this study should be as important as the marshmallow study. So just like if you haven't heard about Pasi Sahlberg Finished Lessons, if you don't know about Elizabeth Bonowitz's study with young kids, you should know about it. You know about it?
Yeah, yeah. I think this group, do you know about the marshmallow study? How many people?
Marshmallow, yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
But I've never told the Bonowitz study publicly, so I'll probably get it wrong, but somebody will correct me. Basically, it works with 3- and 4-year-olds, just like the Stanford preschool marshmallow study. And there are 4 conditions, but the crucial difference is there's a toy of some complexity, and the teacher, in one condition, sort of carefully demonstrates what each part of the toy does, and then leaves the room. We call this the didactic condition. In the second condition, it's the same toy, but the teacher kind of looks perplexed and doesn't know quite what to do, and kind of accidentally touches a few things, and interesting gizmos happen, and she leaves. The dependent variable is how much time does the kid spend, kind of when the experimenter isn't in the room, and the answer is twice as much time in the exploratory condition, where the kid's got an idea, there's lots of stuff there, but the teacher himself didn't know, as into the didactic condition, where the teacher demonstrated end of story. So you can see app dependence is number 1, app exploration is number 2. I think that's going to be the fault line of the 21st century, is which way do we push? Elizabeth Bonowitz, never met her, don't know anything about her, but I think that study is really important. And I hope and pray it doesn't get refuted in the next
Well, you keep giving me the perfect segues to take us to the next. You've talked a lot about, how the focus on STEM is more back to Thorndike a little bit, has maybe is a very important thing for America now, but it may limit the ability to be creative about STEM disciplines. And I recently saw this cover for the Penn World Literature Festival, which made me think of that also. And I wanted to try something here, since you taught me to be a risk taker, and show you some, a lot of people in this audience have thought about cognitive curriculum or social emotional curriculum. So I thought, well, what would be a really interesting thing for this group to kind of do a little group think about? And that would be, if we were going to model the 5 minds for the future in media, what would that media be? And I know that in other talks, when people have tried to describe back to you, oh, so the discipline mind is this, you say, well, close but no cigar. So your job is to say, thumbs up or thumbs down if I've gotten these right. And then I thought that could open up our conversation to other ways of thinking about things people are working on in the room that might relate to some of this work. These are very short clips. This one is my idea of what the discipline mind might be represented. This was a show that we did on environmental education, where we were trying to actually air it in Denmark, where we were concurrent with the Climate Summit, where we were trying to get kids 8 to 12 to really understand the complicated science behind the climate crisis. And this one unpacks the whole concept of 350.
What's the big deal about 350? Well, it's only like the most important number for humans and other living things ever. 350 parts per million is what scientists and climate experts are saying is the most carbon dioxide we can safely have in our atmosphere. In other words, 350 bits of carbon dioxide for every million bits of other gases in the atmosphere. Why is that? When carbon dioxide gets in the upper atmosphere, it traps heat like the glass walls of a greenhouse. More carbon dioxide in the atmosphere means more heat trapped. For 15 million years, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was pretty stable, about 270 parts per million. That kept the climate pretty stable too. But now, because of all the carbon dioxide released from burning fossil fuels like oil, coal, and gas, and from cutting down forests, there are about 390 parts carbon dioxide per million. That means we need to use a lot less fossil fuels by being more efficient and using renewable energy sources like wind and solar instead. If we want to keep the Earth the same place where all us living things grew up on, we'll all need to get together and get carbon dioxide back below 350 parts per million. That's why 350 is my favorite number.
Cute. for what age group is this?
This was 8 to 12.
8 to 12. I think that it gets good grades for saying there's something serious here, which you need to know about and that you need to worry about, but doesn't do it in a hyper Al Gore kind of fashion, which would probably not be appropriate for most kids. I think on its own, it would probably only make sense to the Solcon viewers. I think it would need to have some
More scaffolding.
Well, to teach you to kind of set up what the problem is. It turns out that this has been a bad winter in Boston, but it's been the first bad winter in a long time. I think we need that kind of context.
Yeah. And this is a little bit out of context. It starts with a little cartoon, and then kids get sent to a website where they make their own cartoon. So yeah, that's good. Okay, so at least it's getting close. So this is trying to speak to the question of STEM with art in it.
On the playing field, the race course, and the hallowed halls of competitive sports, athletes push their bodies to the limit. But in the animal kingdom, every day is the ultimate competition where the stakes are survival on land, sea, or air. How would the finest human athletes fare in the animal arena? We'll explore the physics, the physiology, and the math of how animal and human bodies work to find out who will win the wild world of sports.
Synthesize some things about
yeah, I think
sports and math and science.
I think it raises questions in the way that the first one didn't. The first one is more, the 350 is kind of more didactic. There's a right answer and we're going to explain it to you. This is more, why would you think about animals and competition with human beings? So yeah, I think it's somewhat more enabling, whereas the first one is somewhat more just the didactic,
yeah,
if you will. But I miss the STEM-STEAM connection.
Well, I guess in this case, it's trying to, go beyond the typical sort of calculations by showing media that would demonstrate, math or science.
Okay.
So the next one is creating minds. And this is trying to get the idea across that if you're using creativity tools, you can create your own environment. So it's getting back to some of the stuff that Bruner talked about early on about creativity and using digital tools to do that.
Every kid is unique and needs to be part of designing their own change. So we're using kid customizable virtual worlds to have an impact in the actual world. Meet 12-year-old Molly. Molly runs track, loves fashion, dogs, and is terrible at basketball, but wants to get better. This is Molly's Locker, the one-of-a-kind web and mobile experience she designed herself. It contains a whole world where she can keep track of her goals, passions, accomplishments, favorite shows, diet, exercise, everything to do with sports and her health. To help Molly tell her own stories, we developed our proprietary Go real-time platform. Molly can quickly and easily use video, music, graphics, animation, and photography to keep everyone up to date on her personal journey to fitness and sports expertise. As engaging as our kid-generated experience will be, our digital playing field is always tilted towards moving kids away from the screen and into action, though we're always there to lend a helping hand. No boring lectures, just giving kids the digital tools to build a lifelong bond with an active lifestyle.
So I'm going to be a little bit critical here.
Okay, good.
Why didn't you have her talk and describe it herself?
Oh, that's a good question.
This reminded me of the newsreels used to be shown when I was a kid. The movie tone news.
Yeah.
And it would seem to have been the perfect opportunity to have her show what she's doing in her own
You're
way.
absolutely right. And this is more of a kind of, was a
Movie
strategic.
tone news, that's
Yes,
what it is.
movie tone news. This was kind of a strategic way to get people to think about incorporating digital tools to get kids to, you know, like have a repository where they keep information about fitness and try to be creative about their own personal bests and things like that. But that's a very good point. I'm going to rush through here because I know I'm running out of time and I want to. So, Respectful Mind. This is a music video that we made for UNICEF and Amnesty International about the international rights of the child.
Human rights, human rights, human rights, human rights.
From the very beginning of your life,
Human rights, human rights.
you were born with something called human rights.
Human rights.
It don't matter who you are, everybody here above. You got rights, we got rights, everybody's got their human rights. You got rights, we got rights, everybody, everyone, everywhere. There's human rights, everyone, everywhere. There's human rights.
When we were in India, my family and I last year, we observed, you know, not a video, but a drama in a class where there was an interaction between somebody who was presumably of a higher caste and someone who was a lower caste. And the higher caste person kind of dumped on the lower caste person. And then afterwards there was a debrief of it. And I found that to be a very powerful way of conveying the idea of respect, which is a little bit different from ethics. I think within an American context, and this is not particularly about the video per se, we talk too much about rights and not enough about responsibilities. I like to joke that every 4-year-old, the first abstract verb that they learn is the verb to sue. And you know, there are sectors of our country where rights are not respected, but by and large the problem is more that people don't have a sense of responsibility. So I would probably want to balance those two
add that
things.
in there.
Yeah.
So the last one is Ethical Mind, and this is from, some of you may be familiar with this. This is an animation that FlickerLab did for Michael Moore's Bowling for Columbine, and it takes a satirical look about the history of America.
Now it's time for a brief history of the United States of America. Hi, boys and girls, ready to get started? Once upon a time, there were these people in Europe called pilgrims, and they were afraid of being persecuted. So they all got in a boat and sailed to the New World where they wouldn't have to be scared ever again. Oh, I'm so relaxed. I feel so much safer. But as soon as they arrived, they were greeted by savages, and they got scared all over again. So they killed them all. Now, you'd think wiping out a race of people would calm them down, but no. Instead, they started getting frightened of each other. Witch! So they burned witches. In 1775, they started killing the British so they could be free. And it worked, but they still didn't feel safe. So they passed a Second Amendment which said every white man could keep his gun. I loves my gun, loves my gun. Which brings us to the genius idea of slavery. You see, boys and girls, the white people back then were also afraid of doing any work. So they went to Africa, kidnapped thousands of black people, brought them back to America, and forced them to work very hard for no money. And I don't mean no money like I work at Walmart and make no money. I mean $0, nothing, not a zip. Doing it that way made the USA the richest country in the world.
I particularly wanted to show this given the discussion about guns and violence, because we had a bullet as the post.
I would tend to think that this is something that should be shown to older, more sophisticated audiences in an effort to get them to think about different versions of history. I can't imagine it for younger kids.
Yeah, no.
It's sort of like, you know, the complete Shakespeare, you know, in 30 seconds.
Yes.
Sort of thing. But as a provocation, you know, it's more Jon Stewart than it is Looney Tunes.
That's true. So I wanted to just end with, you know, our, as you said, your teacher, my grand teacher, Jerry Bruner. I think so much of it goes back to this whole idea that discovery favors the well-prepared mind. And I know that some of the stuff that you're doing now is for secondary education, and you might want to have an opportunity to talk about that a little bit. But we all wonder what's next for you. What's the next way that you're going to frame the mind? And then I want to open it up to other questions that we have.
Okay, well, I teased Carla a bit about this because, you know, I'm at the age where it would make sense to be looking back, but with a colleague who she knows, Richard Light, who is a professor at Harvard School of Education and the Kennedy School, we are embarking, assuming we get the money, but I think we at least have enough to start, on a study which we're calling LAS 21 or BBB. LAS 21 is Liberal Arts and Sciences in the 21st Century. BBB is Baby Beyond Bathwater. The elevator speech, and this will take 90 seconds, no more, and then we can open it up, is all over the world people admire American liberal arts education. You go to Eastern Europe, you go to East Asia, they want to send their kids to Duke or to Amherst, or they want to set up liberal arts schools in Shanghai or in Berlin. But meanwhile, liberal arts and sciences are really under attack in the United States. They're too expensive. The MOOCs have a lot of potential to do as well or better in teaching than residential education. Kids are hyper-professional, hyper-vocational for understandable but probably not very good reasons. And there's a lot of bad stuff going on campus. A lot of drinking, a lot of binge stuff, a lot of sexual harassment. I'm in Fort at Amherst where we're dealing with a huge scandal. Down the river, half the kids in the class cheated on an exam. It's not something that people at Harvard are very, very proud of. So we want to do a study of Baby Beyond Bathwater means what's the really important stuff that is worth saving in liberal arts education, but how does it need to be reinvented so it isn't too expensive, so it provides stuff which you can't do in a MOOC, and so people realize that if you're hyper-vocational, you're going to be in big trouble if the job that you're hyper-vocational about doesn't exist 5 years from now. So if we were to have a conversation 5 years from now, Dick Light and I will have solved all problems of liberal arts, and then we can retire.
Oh, that would be great, because Dick Light taught me statistics, or I never would be here today, because I probably would have graduated from the doctoral program. Really, just that teacher. So, thank you very much. And I guess it's time
Are we on? At risk of ending up in the next video called The Rude Mind, which I don't want to do. We have time for a couple of questions.
Okay.
Quick ones.
And somebody standing here for a long time.
That's Ashley Brennan, who's helping us.
Oh.
So, she's very enthusiastic, but she has a... Okay, David has a question.
How's it going? So, Brad Bird, who's the director of The Incredibles and Ratatouille, he has a saying that when he creates movies that he wants to see. And I know I'm talking about movies, but kind of talking about those clips aren't appropriate for kids. Just, he says that kids live in an adult world, and sometimes looking at things that are not age appropriate is how their entire life is. They see through their eyes. You know, they're 4 feet tall, and they see a lot of what we see. So what is appropriate to not show them? And
Okay, good question. I'm going to try to be very brief. As you well know, kids are going to see whatever they see, and we can't censor. But there's a different issue from what do we decide as pedagogues, whether we are parents or teachers, that we would like kids to see, and then to have them to understand why, and to engage respectfully with them.
More questions?
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Rachel Connolly. I work with Nova, the PBS show, specifically in education on a project called Nova Labs. The question is about bringing big data and large data sets, and the fact that the products of scientific research are increasingly digital and shareable in nature, and what it's going to take to bring that into a more interactive mode of education or communication. And I think the question I wanted to sort of ask you is, how are, is it the analytical mind? I mean, is there a new type of, mind or intelligence we're going to need to see evolving to handle the big data era? Or are we just going to be increasingly activating the kind of intelligences you already have laid out?
I mean, what I know about big data is very little. But to me, big data are in the middle. But they don't either tell you what questions to ask, nor do they tell you what to do with the answers that you give. And so you'd be a fool not to make use of whatever kind of information you have about anything you're interested in, but you'd be equally foolish if you assume that the only thing we should pay attention to is stuff where we have huge amounts of data, or that the answer to what we should do in a value sense will come out of the data themselves. Just to use an example from the museum world, you'd be nuts not to know how many people come, where they come from, how much time they spend in front of stuff, so on. But you'd be equally a fool if you'd say, well, this is where people go, this is the only thing that we should serve them. And it's the same as I would answer to the first one. In the end, I don't think you can bracket human judgment and human values. That's the big question of the 21st century. That's the Ray Kurzweil question. Are values going to be irrelevant? They're all going to be determined by big data and the computer sciences department at MIT and Harvard, or at the end of the day, are human beings like Carla and me going to decide what to ask and what sense to make out of it? And I don't presume to know the whole answer, but let's say I'm kind of happy that I won't be around if it answered in a way I don't like.
I think we have one more question up here.
Hi. Your work is all about the mind. And what is becoming in vogue now is the brain, including Obama's mapping the brain. Can you do a little compare and contrast about the mind and the brain and how you see that work?
Sure. There's at Harvard something called the Mind, Brain, and Behavior Initiative, which I was involved in from the beginning. And then there's something called Mind, Brain, and Education, where I was actually one of the two architects. There's a lot of information about that stuff available online. The mind is not the same as the brain. The brain is it's a 3-pound organ in here, which we and other organisms have. The mind is basically a philosophical and psychological concept about things that we can do alone or with other people because we have this kind of equipment in here. I think anybody involved in education would be a fool not to, it's a word I used before, would be a fool not to keep up with what's going on in brain studies. That's why we set up these studies. And yet, there's very little that I would do differently now just because we know more about the brain. I would kind of monitor knowledge about the brain. My wife and I discuss this all the time. She's a psychologist too, Helen Winter. And a perfect example of what you talked about was in the New York Times yesterday, and you can see what I read. Eric Kandel, a great Nobel laureate, was talking about art and the brain. And he's written a great book on the topic, and my wife and I both read it sympathetically. I think Eric is great, but we both agreed there was nothing in the article which really depended on what we know about the brain. It was completely about the mind. So as an exercise, I suggest you go read that article. It will take you 5 minutes. Kandel, NYT, April 14th, right? And see whether there's anything in there that he would have said differently if he didn't even know there was such a thing as a brain. And that's the challenge. And I hope that if you got something out of this Q&A, you got less my answers, which I could critique, but more the way I tend to think about these things, which is, at which point do we let the brain or data dictate things, and at which point do we retain our own judgment about what's important and how to make sense of it?
It's a great way to end, and of course, with an assignment for all of us. I think you mentioned 3 different articles. If you're taking notes, that you should all go look up online, hopefully not during some of the presentations. Thank you so much.